Good afternoon and welcome to Across the Fence. I'm Jolie Whitney. UVM commencement takes place this coming weekend, May 17th. For students in Professor Luis Vivanco's class, a final exam looks much different than other final exams. That's because Professor Vivanco encourages students to draw what they have to say rather than put it into words. Luis is the chair of the UVM anthropology department. He teaches at UVM and runs a comic-based research lab at the university. Welcome to Across the Fence.
Thank you, Jolie. I'm really happy to be here.
And we're happy to have you. When did you decide that drawing pictures could be better or complement writing things instead?
Well, it was probably about 7 or 8 years ago. I was director of our Humanities Center. We held a big comics conference, and I was sitting in the crowd listening to a historian, a history professor, talking about his latest book, which was a graphic version of some history research he was doing. And I thought, how does that happen? You know, I was just there because we sponsored this event, but it really captured my imagination, this idea that you could take your publications and make them comics. So I ran up to him right afterwards. I was like, how do you do this? And he says, well, you need an illustrator. And I was like, oh, dang. I don't have an illustrator. I don't have any money. So I walked away thinking to myself, well, that was interesting and fun, but it stuck with me. And so I started experimenting. I started drawing. I used to draw as a kid. At some point, someone told me, probably, you're not very good at this, so go do your social science and humanities stuff. So I just picked up a pencil and just started going at it, and I looked at a lot of comics. And eventually I thought, there's something to this. I think I can run with this. So it was new to me, you know, but after about 7 or 8 years now, I feel really comfortable doing it.
That's incredible. And most people kind of think of comics as comic strips or comic books. So what you're teaching really different from that, or is there a lot of overlap?
Oh, there is a lot of overlap. The question of what is comics really flummoxed me getting into this. I was like, well, you know, does a single panel, I don't know, Far Side cartoon, is that a comic? Is a comic more like a 4-panel strip, or is it a graphic novel, right? They've become really popular. And it's kind of all those things. One thing that is true about comics is it's in sequence and it tells a story. So comics is really a storytelling medium, and I've always thought of myself as a scholar, as a cultural anthropologist, as a storyteller. And it just brings in images to communicate as much as the words communicate. So the idea is that words and images are working together in a kind of dance. Sometimes one leads, the other times another one leads. And they have this sort of superpower when you combine them. That was a revelation to me, honestly, because I wrote, right, for years. But I had never thought about the role of visual imagery in my work. And so I really am committed now to that as an important way of communicating and just exploring the stories that I want to tell.
And you obviously teach a class that includes students making these comics like this. So what kind of assignments are you having them do? What do they explore with images and text?
So right now I'm teaching environmental anthropology, and I gave students the option to do a creative project. I think that's a big change that I see after 27 years at UVM, is that we're much more open to creative projects instead of just term papers. It's not to say that students aren't writing a lot in my class, but they have the option of doing something creative. And so I have probably about 4 or 5 student groups working on comics right now. And what I find with them is that they're unleashed, they're excited. This is an opportunity for them to really deeply connect with the material. Now, I don't know, 15 years ago, could I have done that? I'm not sure. I feel like the graphic novel and its rise in the last 15 years has changed the game so that students are more visually engaged. In fact, they say that comics is like it's like the source code for our era in terms of the visuality. You know, we're always on Instagram and all these other sort of social media things, looking at images, and so students these days are just so more deeply engaged with images than like I was at their age. So I can kind of turn to them and say, do you want to do a comic for your final project? And a lot of them are game, and they're willing, and they're pretty savvy about images. Doesn't mean they know how to draw. I do a fair amount of just sort of explaining to them, go look at other people's drawings and don't accept that you don't know how to draw. Like, that's the first thing that I hear a lot. Oh, I don't know how to draw. And then I just sort of show them expressive stick figures.
Okay.
Like, it's cool to do stick figures. I've seen some amazing comics with just stick figures. you
Sure.
know?
So the quality of the drawing doesn't always factor that much into the grade.
Right. And ultimately, it's about telling a story. I think that's the important thing about comics. It's about telling stories. And stick figures can tell stories just as well as a photo can that's super realistic. So I try to help students have confidence that they can start where they start, and we'll focus on the story that they want to tell.
And we talked about this a little bit before we started filming, but what is it like trying to grade a medium like that? Is there anything different you have to consider as opposed to just an essay?
Oh boy, I'm a warrior over the years of spelling and grammar and paragraph structure. So when I started doing this, this required me to shift how I think about, grade assessment, really. And so the way of assessing a comic is so different. What I'm trying to get at, because comics are really so simplified, is not, do they have really long, beefy quotations and did they properly cite things? It's more, do they capture the idea? Comics is a really great medium for sharing ideas. Because you're really focusing on the underlying dynamics of interactions or of stories that are really important. And when you have images, I had to learn how to assess those in different ways. I can assess the words, I can see, are they getting to the idea? But comics are brief, right? So the wording is brief. So I had to figure out, well, does the image work well with the comic? That took a real paradigm shift for me as a grader.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and a lot of it is I do it myself, right? I think it would be harder if I didn't do this myself. And I'm always struggling and trying to figure out, how do I communicate the important ideas? And that comic I just gave you.
Oh, this one here.
Yes, that one there is trying to do that, right? I made this for my students. We're doing I have a little group of students doing research on crow-human interactions in Burlington. And I wanted to share with them some of the ideas around how do you do research as an anthropologist with crows in the mix? Like, so we anthropologists, we work with people. We don't work with animals,
sure.
right?
Yeah.
So what does it mean to do that kind of research? And there's all kinds of big philosophical ideas about what we call multi-species ethnography. But I wanted to make this accessible, that multi-species ethnography isn't some scary, jargony kind of term. Underlying it is just some ideas about engaging openly with the environment around you. And so I dig into this, in this comic, into some big ideas, but I try and do it in ways that are accessible. And so that's one of the cool things for me about comics, is that it allows my work to be very accessible.
And that's not the only place you've used anthropology and comics. Talk a little bit about the
right.
bicycle project, if you will.
Oh boy, the bicycle project is really the kind of the way into comics for me. So when I was sitting in that crowd listening to that history professor, what was going through my mind was, I give a lecture around the state of Vermont through Vermont Humanities Speakers Bureau on the history of bicycles in Vermont. And it's a spin-off of a research project I did about 10, 12 years ago on the anthropology of the bicycle. And I was doing field work here in Burlington and a few other cities around the world, looking at how bikes play a role in urban change and so on, and social movements with bikes. And in the background, I knew that northern New England was at the heart of what was called the bicycle craze in the 1890s. And so I developed this lecture because a lot of that stuff didn't show up in my book. It was a really interesting time when bicycles were protagonists in big social change. And people were really debating, are bicycles bad for you? Are they good for you? Are they disruptive to urban life? And so on. And so going through my mind was, that lecture, people are going to surely get tired of this. They haven't. I still give it around the state. But I thought, well, maybe my next step is make comics about this. So I've made a bunch of mini comics and zines that are showing pieces of that historical research. And the thing I love about it is that it can play with ideas, it can tell history, it can tell really great stories from the past that we've otherwise lost or people just wouldn't know. But there's a chuckle sometimes in these, and there's sometimes not a chuckle. Sometimes they're really serious. But that medium of comics is a really great way to share those stories. And at this point, I want to say I've given away thousands of these little mini comics to people, just to share with them these little tidbits of Vermont history.
Sure. So is that what we're talking about when we say Professor Luis Vivanco's Illustrated Explanatory of Bicycle Ailments, Maladies, and Injuries, 2nd edition, 2020?
Yes, the second edition was in 2020. So that is, I did a bunch of research on the medical debates over bicycles in the 1890s. And it was intense, let me tell you. People were especially concerned about a range of maladies and diseases that bicycles caused. And in fact, there was a UVM professor of nervous disorders who wrote a whole 350-page book on bicycles. And his declaration was they're good for people.
Oh, that's good.
Yes.
So talk about bicycle face. Is that one of these maladies?
Yes, bicycle face was one of these maladies, and it was, now mind you, this is in the medical literature. I found this all in medical journals. Bicycle face was the contortions that your face got stuck in because of too much joy or going too fast. So it was like, and people were really freaked out by that. But what's interesting is and important is it was targeted at women. Because women were using the bicycle to emancipate themselves. There was this recognition that the bicycle gave women an opportunity to get out in the public sphere without chaperones. There was a whole fight over women's clothing, that women's clothing is too constrictive. Well, if they want to exercise and have bicycle access, they got to have more loose clothing. So there was this whole change in women's clothing. And the reaction from the male medical establishment was not positive. It was like, women, you're going to get ugly if you have too much fun on bicycles. So really, you shouldn't be out there riding bicycles.
How about scorching? Scorching
was a massive moral panic in the 1890s. So the way bicycling worked when it first takes shape in the 1880s is that you were in wheelmen's clubs, and they rode in formation like cavalry units. They had buglers, they had uniforms, and they would go on runs in the countryside in formation, like a cavalry unit, right? And so eventually the bicycle picks up, it becomes very popular, and people who were not joining these clubs were riding bicycles by themselves. They were riding them for transportation. They were going from point A to point B. They weren't leisure devices, in other words. And those were scorchers. They were, there was a moral panic because they were seen to be people who were threatening public order.
I'm sorry, we're actually out of time.
Oh my gosh, already?
Yeah, you'll have to get the comic and learn about it.
Get the comic.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and that takes care of our program for today. I want to thank the crew behind the scenes here at WCAX. I'm Jolie Whitney. This is Across the Fence. Have a good one.